Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. We are back once more with Dr. Judd Burton and Dr. Aaron Judkins, and we're talking about Göbekli Tepe. And I think I'm going to ask the question now that I'm betting a lot of our viewers have been waiting for, and that is this like ancient alien stuff? What if anybody who combs the internet for Göbekli Tepe is going to run into ancient alien sort of stuff related to the site, why the site's there, who built it, of course, and what its ultimate purpose was. So, I mean, you guys have had to deal with this. So let's hear.
Sure.
What is this ancient alien?
Well, yeah, I mean, just in the course of the literature review, you're going to you got to run into a number of authors that write that sort of material. But no, the short answer is no. It's not.
Well, that's just a colossal disappointment.
Well, yeah, I'm sure that it is. I'm sure that it is. But I mean, that's the fact of the matter is that, when you look at the approach that Ancient Aliens takes, you run into researchers who may be, good at ferreting out some things, but they're not necessarily disciplined or trained researchers, and people who are not they're not trained archaeologists, they're not trained historians, they're not linguists or anthropologists for the most part. They're completely out of their depth, making these grand assumptions without actually weighing the evidence. And Göbekli Tepe is one of many cases that, people that are familiar with the show Ancient Aliens, they do this almost on a weekly basis with the content that they produce. But Aaron and I are trying to marry the archaeological, anthropological approach with the biblical approach, looking at this through the biblical lens, and finding some, convergency between the evidence that archaeologists have put up, without having to resort to conclusions that aren't really based in a textual or cultural tradition like we're actually going from. Like, we have not just the archaeological material from Göbekli Tepe, but we're using the textual tradition of the biblical narrative and all of the culture and the historical evidence that goes along with that.
What do you think is give me one or two things about the site that are sort of the go-to footholds, or the favorite sort of, I don't know, data points. I use that term loosely here, okay? But what some of the data points that someone would look at the site and say, this is evidence for ancient aliens. Give me some ideas as to what they're going to gravitate toward and use, to that end.
Well, the identification of for one, like Enclosure D is such a great example of where you get a smattering of the different kinds of evidences that we find at Göbekli Tepe and the places that have been excavated and uncovered already. They're going to point to the anthropomorphic pillars and say that, okay, these are the aliens. These are clearly, they're definitely other, but where we would disagree that, you're dealing with extraterrestrial biological entities, that's what it always boils down to with most of the ancient alien material, is that they were perceived to be gods, that their supernatural characteristics don't even enter into it. And so I think that that's a really clear example, are the anthropomorphic pillars that you find in places like Enclosure D.
Yeah. When I hear that, I think, a lot of our viewers, even, if they're used to the content here at Fringe Pop, and also, but they wouldn't have to be exposed to ancient aliens as far as what the History Channel does. But when I hear that, I can imagine a viewer saying, well, what's the difference between what these two guys are doing and what the ancient alien theorist is doing? Well, just on the surface, I mean, think about it. You referenced the textual tradition. Okay, in the biblical textual tradition, God, okay, or supernatural beings, let's just call them angels or whatever, watchers, you could use that as well. They appeared to people in human form. So you have a textual tradition of that, instance that you can, look at that and think, okay, anthropomorphic form over here, textual tradition over there, those two things sort of align. What's missing from that is, you could look at that and say, well, the aliens, they're kind of humanoid, but then it's like, well, really, are they? I mean, just think about how they're typically portrayed. There's a disconnect there. But the bigger disconnect is, and this I think is just across the board, you don't have any ancient textual traditions of the gods coming to Earth in a craft from anywhere else.
Yeah.
Zero. I mean, you can say that the ancients would have seen an extraterrestrial and interpret that as a god. You go ahead and say that, but let's put that into the picture, the whole orb picture that you're trying to recreate.
Yeah, the mechanics of a craft is not there.
The mechanics of the visitation. You literally don't have that. And you would think that if this is the story that an ancient textual tradition, whether it's Egypt or Mesopotamia or whatever, if this is what they're trying to relay, that's a pretty dramatic thing to miss, to not have in the story.
Yeah.
So it's really not the same thing. It's a very surface similarity, but I like that example. I thought, and Judd, maybe or Aaron want to comment on this, but I would have to think one of the things that people gravitate to or toward is the presumed technology. To build the site. So we run into that.
Well, you do. We're not the pinnacle of the greatest of human species here. From an evolutionary concept of what Ancient Aliens presents, more specifically, a panspermia theory, if you will, that we were seeded here. This is one that supposedly we've been seeded here from life on other planets. This is a concept that's, well designed into the ancient alien theory.
Yeah, it's pretty entrenched.
It is, and most of this is a concept based on evolutionary life origins, and it comes down to, where do we come from? Who are we? Where are we going? What is our purpose here? And the four great questions of life, most people can't answer. And so it comes down to basically a search for where do we come from and why are we here? And Ancient Aliens tries to, I think, answer those questions in light of an evolutionary panspermia concept. What Judd and I are approaching this area of Göbekli Tepe is from a biblical lens, but a historical concepts of ancient literature, archaeology, linguistics, iconography, and cultural material evidence that we've had in the region. And so when you put all this together in a greater context, I believe that it's showing us a different picture. It's not showing us an evolutionary concept of man coming up from eons of time, what I call pond scum to Einstein. It's showing us something very different, very opposite. We talked about Göbekli Tepe being a paradigm shift and how it's very, very different from what we would have expected. This is something that is also very different, is that there is no evolutionary, cultural evolutionary processes going on here. There's a very sudden onset of a Neolithic revolution that's happening. And so this is an area that Jed and I are approaching this from a biblical context of what the Bible has to say about those four great questions of life. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where is our purpose here? And where are we going? And that's really the central questions that people want to know. Why are we here? And most people can't answer that. Unfortunately, most people don't know the answer for that. And what we want to do is present this in a way that is based in, good archaeological evidence, good sound out and thought research, and try to give an answer to people maybe that they haven't heard before. And that is the answer of, we're here for a reason. We're here for a purpose. We weren't just, a spontaneous matter that came together for no hope, no reason. Why? Mm-hmm. There's a greater question here that's underlying. And I think the ancients knew that, and were trying to answer that for themselves.
Yeah, you look at the way, just generally across the board with ancient texts. Well, the gods put us here. If you look at the descriptions, I'm going to use the phrase, almost never do you see anything other than like a direct creative act, like a deity or deities will take something physical and manipulate it or form a human or whatever. And that's a lot different than this random seeding idea. So the ancient aliens, if you're taking that form of panspermia, it has a problem connecting that again to a textual tradition, even though they'll never tell you that on the show. They'll just sort of make you assume that there's this connection actually exists. And on the rare occasion, like the Sumerian story where the planting metaphor is used for humans, there what they won't tell you is that that's one creation story out of a bunch, and it's unique. And so, like, if this was the story, why aren't they all the same? There are just disconnects like this that it seems the model that Ancient Aliens wants to create does try to answer those questions.
Yeah.
And they sort of, they'll find a data point that sort of sounds like it goes with the idea they want to promote, and then they'll either abandon it when they need to, and hopefully the viewer will never notice that, or it's like it won't matter anyway because it doesn't fit with the rest of the stuff they're telling you.
Again, this is the difference between interest and authority. There's a marked difference between I'm preaching to the choir here because we've all gone through it. The years and hours we spend training to do this. There's a difference between the kind of process that we use for research and producing results that's hopefully, ideally reasoned and rational.
Yeah, your professors and your advisors in a real degree program, they'll see where the outliers are in what you're saying, and they won't just turn away.
No.
They'll beat you over the head with them.
Sure.
You have to account for these things. But if you're just sort of freewheeling it, on a show, nobody's going to care, or perhaps even notice.
Right.
But to me, that's the most disturbing part of it, where they can look at a site like Göbekli Tepe. Oh, look, anthropomorphic forms, or how did they do this or that?
Right.
And then it's almost like they presume that the audience thinks that questions are answers.
You're right. Yeah.
Actually, they're not.
Yeah.
Questions are not answers.
Yeah.
They are questions.
They tend to make a lot of questions.
In the way they present it.
Yeah.
The fact that I can look into a camera and look mysterious or thoughtful and ask a question. Okay, that's not an answer. It's a question.
I like what Graham Hancock said. He said, we're a species with amnesia. And I tend to agree with that statement. We've forgotten, I think, in a lot of cases about where we came from.
Right.
And, archaeology is a study of, a cultural, historical context where we're trying to put pieces of the puzzle back together. And sometimes we don't have all the picture. In most cases, we don't.
Yeah.
You're trying to put little things back together to create a bigger picture. And not knowing how or why is not an excuse to not answer the questions.
Or at least try.
Or at least try to answer the questions.
And with prehistory, it's difficult. It's made more difficult because you don't have text, to work with. There's a a greater hermeneutic at work, you know, in terms of interpreting the material and the site and the features and what have you. Yeah, and I like what Hancock says, and it's okay to say I don't know at the end of the day, but you should always make an effort to answer as many of those questions as you possibly
Well, and to
can.
present it as evidence.
Yeah.
In a show like Ancient Aliens, that
It's
presents it
disingenuous, yeah.
as evidence, perhaps, that is problematic.
Yeah.
Because people take that and they say, well, a site like Göbekli Tepe, what else could it be?
Mhm.
Ancient Aliens.
Yeah.
Well, wait a minute. You know, normally things in the past are explained much more simply. It's called Ogman's razor.
Right.
You know,
Ogman's
usually the
razor.
simplest explanation is usually the right one. This is not new to science. Science should be self-correcting. We should lean on the empirical evidence of what we see, and archaeology is just that. It's digging in the dirt. What do we see? What is the record, if you will, trying to tell us? Who were the people? Why were they here? What were they doing?
Mm-hmm.
And from a biblical point of view, of where Judd and I is coming from a historical concept, is that indeed there is a very specific thing we think they were doing at Göbekli Tepe, and we think that they came together for a very special purpose, probably on more than one occasion over a long period of time, to do something that they had lost in the past. They had lost their own past at some point.
Which certainly has to do with the supernatural, but it doesn't have anything to do with the paradigm that's being presented on shows like Ancient Aliens or any of the other sort of ancient mysteries
Right.
approaches.
It's really unfortunate because on the one hand, Ancient Aliens will appeal to the audience's hunger for mystery and transcendence. But if you're assuming that the gods or any kind of supernatural reality is just aliens, in other words, it's a material being that's part of the cosmos, then you've played off the hunger or the need for knowledge about a world, the spiritual world that is transcendent,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps your place in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the bait. And then you switch with, it's just a materialistic world anyway,
Mm-hmm.
so we can't offer you any hope anyway.
Which is so amazing because we already know just from a philosophical and let's just say biological perspective that the naturalistic approach to like human cell biology that doesn't even completely work because biologists to understand the cell now are having to rely less on evolutionary theory and more on engineering design theory.
Yeah, where I teach just this past week, I had a geneticist, I brought him into my class for a Q&A, and very upfront saying, look, science can't answer lots of questions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. But the way that science tends to be presented in these things as sort of either a substitute for a transcendent, non-material reality or an explanation for that reality, that to me that's what's misleading. It's because that casts science as either the ultimate point of knowledge or
Mm-hmm.
the answer, having the answer for everything, and neither of those things is true.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you sort of again take advantage of that impulse in people, which is very understandable, in a show like Ancient Aliens, and again you use that hunger as bait to get people to watch.
Mm-hmm.
But then what you're actually giving them at the end of the day, if they really thought about it, which most viewers won't, if they really thought about it, it's like, well, how is that really satisfactory? How does that give me hope?
Mm-hmm.
That there is really no spiritual world out there. It's just material beings from some other place in the universe. It doesn't offer you anything, but of course it's not presented that way. So you have this sort of bait and switch thing going on. Let me ask you one more question before we wrap up our discussion here. Do you suspect, maybe that's the right word, do you suspect that these sorts of sites where you don't have text, and they are prehistoric, they are Neolithic, do you suspect at all that ancient aliens theorists really like these sites because they can't be pinned down by like an intellectual record?
Mm-hmm.
Or is that just me? Am I operating too much with a hermeneutic of suspicion there? But
No,
I get that feeling sometimes.
I think Aaron would agree. He can voice, but I think they're easy pickings in a lot of ways because they don't have those textual traditions, or at least not. There's possibility that there's some proto language at Göbekli Tepe, and Aaron's done some really good work on that. But yeah, as a general rule of thumb, because so much of it is open to interpretation, those kinds of sites are easy pickings.
Well, it's like I said earlier, not knowing how or why something occurred doesn't, give us the right to just draw conclusions without evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's one thing to form a hypothesis, and then if you have some evidence on that to form a theory, that's part of what science is. We should be able to ask questions. There's nothing wrong with that. That's how we develop these hypotheses that moves into theory, that move into law. The problem is with shows like Ancient Aliens that support an evolutionary point of view that we were seated here. Really gives people a sense of false hope, and I think one of the disconnects is that because it's so far back in time, well, no one can really know, so we're just going to draw some conclusions for the audience, or we're going to pose some questions that would suggest perhaps that it was ancient technology, because after all, these people were Stone Age. How in the world do they have the intellectual capability when all they could really do was start fires and live in caves? That's not true. That whole sense of we're smarter than they are is not right.
It doesn't hold.
These people in the ancients were I think they were more intelligent than we are today. So it's more of how did we lose the knowledge that they had? How did we lose the capability to learn? Mm-hmm. That's a great question, because one of the things I'll pose in the book is maybe Göbekli Tepe isn't Neolithic. Maybe they're looking in the wrong timeline. There's a possibility that's true. This has happened before in archaeology, especially in Egyptian history, where David Rohl did some riveting work in his book, A Test of Time, in Volume 1, and he shows that Genesis, at least in the second half of Genesis, has actual basis in historicity in archaeology. And he's an agnostic. Mm-hmm. And he's one of the guys saying, hey, this has some basis in history here. And he shows that the Egyptologists were not even looking in the right timeline. When you adjust the time frame, then the evidence is actually there. They're just looking in the wrong timeline. Mm. And so he put out a new chronology called the Revised Egyptian Chronology that really syncs up very well to the historicity of the Old Testament. Now, he's one of the few guys who's ever done that work. I think maybe could be a similar case with Göbekli Tepe.
I mean, the chronology, I used to be really into ancient chronology, and I'm acquainted with Rohl's work quite a bit. There's always uncertainties that the average person in the public isn't really privy to, that could change things, and so maybe there'll be something like that comes along the pike. But this has been good, again, because I do think this is a site, and it's just one of many examples that have been co-opted, to prop up a certain narrative that's really it's not only unfortunate, but it doesn't deliver. So thanks again for discussing this with us and being with us. And thank you for watching another episode of Fringe Pop 321. Please visit our website, fp321.com, for more information about this episode, our other interviews, and really everything we do to get good resource information in more detail. And please come back again and keep watching, because what you know may not be so.